Our second reading this morning is from the book of Genesis, chapter 39, verses 1 through 23, which is found on page 33 of your pew Bibles. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, the officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eye upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. But one day when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled, and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand, and that he had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house." Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to her, "This is the way that your servant treated me," his anger was kindled, and Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were there in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Last week we heard the story of God's promises to Abram. Promises to give him land, descendants, and blessings, through which the whole world would be blessed. This week we see the promises continuing through Abraham's great-grandson Joseph, of the Technicolor Dreamcoat fame. As we look at this story, it may be difficult to see how God's promise to Abraham and his descendants is now at work in Joseph's life, as he has been sold into slavery by his brothers, no less, and is a servant in Egypt. And it may be even more difficult to see the blessings, as he has then gone from being a servant to being thrown into prison unjustly. How could this possibly be a demonstration of God's hesed, which is faithful loving kindness toward Abraham's family? Let's start with a little review of the story. Joseph is the youngest son of Jacob and the most beloved. Needless to say, he's a little indulged. and his brothers resent him for it. It doesn't make it any easier that Joseph lords it over his brothers a little bit and shares a dream with them that he had that they would all bow down to him. Then his father gave him a fabulous robe to wear, and that was kind of the last straw. When Joseph goes out to visit his brothers as they tend the flocks, they plot at first to kill him, but his brother Reuben convinces them to sell him to the Ishmaelites instead. Now remember, the Ishmaelites would be the descendants of Abraham's other son, Ishmael. So then Joseph's brothers took and ripped up his robe, spread goat's blood on it, and took it back to their father Jacob, telling him that a wild animal must have killed his son. Pretty much your typical family dynamic, right? Sibling rivalry, betrayal, kidnapping, lies, deceit, the whole 9 yards. Meanwhile, Joseph is in Egypt and bought by Potiphar as a slave, and he was successful at everything he did. And so Potiphar put him in charge of his house and affairs. Not bad. But Potiphar's wife wants to put Joseph in charge of another sort of affair, which he declines because he would be breaking trust with both his earthly master and his God. And you know the rest. We find Joseph in the king's prison, which is actually much better than it could have been, because I doubt that many masters would have responded with such restraint when a slave has been charged with assaulting the master's wife. I would have easily expected a death sentence. But even though Joseph is in prison, God is still with him, blessing everything he does, so that he finds favor with the chief jailer, who puts Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners. So Joseph is doing pretty well, despite his situation. But how does this show God's faithfulness to the promises of Abraham, which were land, blessing, and blessings to the whole world? Well, we can see that Joseph is receiving some blessings, as he could easily have been killed by either his brothers or Potiphar. But these are not the kind of faithful blessings that anyone would like to have in their lives. How many of you list servitude and prison on their wish lists? Anyone? We have all heard the expression, "The Lord works in mysterious ways." I think this is a prime example. Joseph's blessings have been causing him problems. So maybe they're sort of the mixed blessing type. But God knows what's coming, and so God is using circumstances and human emotions to move Joseph to where he is needed. Joseph is not going to be able to do much for anyone if he stays at home with his family. So some sibling rivalry starts the ball rolling. And then Joseph's brothers kindly arrange transport for him to Egypt, albeit in less than first-class accommodations. So far, so good. There, Joseph is bought by a high-ranking official in the military and works his way up to a valued and trusted position in the household, which is not a bad position to be in. But that is not the position that God needs him in either. So again, God uses human emotion, in this case, lust and anger, to have Joseph moved again, this time to the king's prison. Again, not the best of accommodations, but one step closer to where God needs him to be. During this time, God also seems to be teaching Joseph a little humility, turning him from the spoiled brat that he was at home to a faithful and efficient manager. And even in prison, Joseph does well. And we know that this is where Joseph needs to be to come to the king's attention. After all, it's not often that a Hebrew is going to wind up in the company of the king of Egypt. But we know that Joseph will do just that, and the cycle will continue of Joseph being blessed and being moved up into the position of second in command. The next time it will be over all of Egypt. Again, if Joseph had stayed in charge of Potiphar's house, he would have only been of limited use. But we can see God's promised blessings at work. Joseph is doing pretty well, considering, and all the people that he comes in contact with are blessed by his blessedness. While these blessings have not yet accrued to the whole world, they are growing in magnitude. The next series of blessings will put Joseph in service to the king, resulting to the whole nation and all the Egyptians being blessed to living through the coming 7 years of famine. And not just the Egyptians, but Joseph's own family, who could have easily become victims of the family, will be saved as well. So God is keeping God's promise to bless the descendants of Abraham and to provide for their future, and bless increasingly greater portions of the world through them. At the same time, the God of Abraham and Joseph is becoming known and honored beyond the family and country of Abraham. Now, most ancient deities were thought to be limited to a certain geographic region in which they were worshipped. But the God who created the whole world can go and work anywhere, as is being proved by Joseph in Egypt. No doubt this is not the way that Joseph would have chosen to be a blessing to the world, and it was not an easy path to travel, and it could not have been very enjoyable, all the ups and downs that he was experiencing. But Joseph remained faithful to God and to himself. And Joseph became the very definition of a faithful, honorable servant and leader. Just the kind of follower that God wants. Now, it would have been easy for Joseph to give in to Potiphar's wife and go on to live a fairly easy and luxurious life. But it would not have been a faithful or honorable thing to do, and that is at the core of who Joseph is. God had to work in some pretty convoluted ways to get Joseph where God needed him, but it happened. And it would have been very easy for Joseph to give in and have a major pity party anywhere along the way. And who would have blamed him? Woe is me! I was terribly wronged by my brothers. I'll just give up. Or, having overcome that, he could have easily given up after being slandered and unjustly sent to prison. Boy, if this is what I get for being faithful, I am done with that. It just doesn't even make any sense to try. I can't catch a break. The whole friggin' world is against me. Woe is me. But Joseph seems to recognize his blessedness in each situation and keeps plugging away. And each time he gets knocked down, he gets back up and keeps rising even higher and higher. God is able to redeem all of Joseph's suffering and turn it into blessings. If we look at it from the New Testament perspective, we can see quite a few parallels to the Jesus story. Remember the words of Jesus we heard earlier from Matthew. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so men persecuted the prophets who were before you. Have you ever looked at your life from a Joseph perspective? Have you ever wondered if God was behind the scenes, working to put you where you needed to be? I have to admit that there have been a few times where I've wondered if I have heard God right, or even if God has forgotten me. It took 4 years after graduating from seminary to wind up here at my first church. At times it was depressing, and I got to wondering occasionally if all that time at seminary had been wasted. But during those years, I was still active in church and still learning and leading. Not in the ways I would have chosen, mind you, but evidently in the ways that God chose for me. And I feel blessed to be here. Where has God put you? How can God use you to bless those around you? We don't have to do grand and glorious things like Joseph's did, like saving a country and an entire region from famine. Working at and supporting the food pantry can keep our neighbors from going hungry. Being active in the village or other service organizations can make our community a better place to live. A number of people were blessed by the church's hospitality yesterday at the Olson's memorial service. We can be blessed to be a blessing to those around us. And if we are lucky, we can also shine the light of Jesus on some of those who live in darkness. We do not have to live lives of ease or comfort to be truly blessed. Joseph and Jesus certainly did not. But we can still be faithful over those things that God sets before us and make a difference in our world and in God's world. For those people that God puts in our paths. May we never tire of doing good, as Joseph continued doing. And may we live lives that God would be proud of, as Joseph did. May we be blessed to be a blessing. May it be so for you and for me. Amen.